One cold morning, a homeless Navy SEAL stepped off a bus in the middle of Kansas with nothing but an old backpack and a loyal German shepherd walking beside him. He had no family waiting, no job, no real place to go. But in his hand was a letter from a lawyer, claiming that a man he barely remembered had left him an entire farm. Daniel thought it had to be a mistake. Why would a stranger leave everything to him? What he didn't know was that years earlier, in the chaos of war, one small decision he made had quietly changed another man's life forever. Before we begin this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? The wind came down from the Rocky Mountains like a blade. Late autumn had settled over Billings, Montana, turning the sky into a hard gray ceiling that seemed permanently pressed against the land. The streets were damp from a night of freezing rain, and a restless wind swept across empty parking lots, rattling loose signs and pushing cold air through every crack it could find. On the edge of a half-empty supermarket parking lot sat an old 2007 Ford F-150. Its paint faded and scratched from years of use. A thin layer of frost had begun forming along the windshield. Inside the truck, a man stirred. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, though most people guessed he was older. He had the build of someone who had spent most of his adult life carrying heavy gear, broad shoulders, thick forearms, and a posture that stayed alert even when he was resting. His face was sharply cut, with a square jaw and a narrow scar that ran from the corner of his right eyebrow toward his temple, a souvenir from a mission years ago. Dark brown hair, clipped short in a military style, had begun to show streaks of gray near the sides. A few days of rough stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes were the part people remembered most. They were pale blue and always searching, like a man constantly scanning a horizon that might suddenly erupt. Daniel had served 14 years in the United States Navy, most of that time attached to a Special Operations Support Unit that worked closely with Navy SEAL teams. He had deployed to places most Americans only saw on maps during news reports. Dusty coastlines, crowded desert towns, airstrips where the heat shimmered like a mirage. Out there, everything had been simple. Clear missions, clear enemies, clear brothers beside him. Back home, nothing felt clear at all. A heavy weight pressed gently against his chest. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. A pair of amber eyes stared back at him. "Morning, Max," Daniel muttered. The dog lifted his head. Max was a 6-year-old German shepherd, large even for the breed, nearly 90 pounds of muscle and thick black and tan fur. His ears stood tall and alert, and his intelligent eyes followed every movement Daniel made. A faint scar ran across the dog's muzzle, barely visible beneath the fur. Max had been trained as a military working dog before Daniel adopted him during his final deployment. Where Daniel had once been a calm, focused operator, the war had carved deep lines into him. After a roadside explosion during their last mission, Daniel began suffering from violent panic attacks and insomnia. Max had been assigned to him as a support dog. The bond formed almost instantly. The dog had saved Daniel's life more than once, not with teeth or strength, but by sensing the storms building in his mind before they arrived. Now Max nudged Daniel's arm with his nose. The message was clear. Get up. Daniel pushed himself upright, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Outside, the wind slammed a loose shopping cart into the side of the truck with a loud metallic clang. Daniel flinched before he could stop himself. Max leaned closer, pressing his body against Daniel's leg until the tension slowly drained from his shoulders. "I'm good," Daniel whispered, more to himself than the dog. He stepped out of the truck. The cold air hit him instantly. Montana mornings had a way of reminding people that nature was always stronger. Daniel pulled his worn navy blue jacket tighter around himself. The jacket still carried a faint stitched patch on the sleeve, the faded eagle insignia of the U.S. Navy. Most employers noticed it. Most of them nodded politely, and then they never called back. Daniel walked Max across the empty lot toward a narrow strip of frozen grass near the sidewalk. The dog moved with steady discipline, scanning the area the way he had been trained. Max had never truly left the war either. Daniel watched the dog and felt a quiet, familiar gratitude. "You're doing better than me, buddy." Max flicked his ears but said nothing, of course. Afterward, Daniel returned to the truck and checked his phone. No new emails, no missed calls. 3 weeks earlier, he had applied for a warehouse position, a security job at a construction company, a delivery driver position, a maintenance role at a school district. All of them had ended the same way. "Thank you for your service. We'll be in touch." They never were. Daniel started the truck. The engine coughed once before settling into a rough idle. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. He did the math automatically. $36 left in his checking account. 2 days of gas if he was careful. 3 if he didn't drive. He glanced at the passenger seat. Max was already sitting upright again, calm and watchful. The dog never seemed worried about tomorrow. Daniel wished he knew how to do that. They drove across town to a small diner Daniel had visited a few times while job hunting. The neon sign flickered weakly in the gray morning light. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. A woman stood behind the counter, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs. Her name was Sarah Whitmore. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slightly thin, with sandy blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail that hung over one shoulder. A few strands had escaped and framed a face lined gently by years of long shifts and early mornings. Her skin carried the pale, freckled tone common to people who had grown up in the northern plains. She had the steady, practical eyes of someone who had seen many kinds of hardship and had decided long ago that complaining wouldn't fix any of it. She noticed Daniel the moment he stepped inside. "Morning, sailor," she said with a faint smile. Daniel nodded. "Morning." Max stayed close at his side, calm but alert. Sarah leaned over the counter to look at the dog. "Well now," she said softly. "That's a serious-looking partner you got there." "His name's Max." Max watched her carefully but didn't move. Sarah chuckled. "Polite one." Daniel slid into a booth. Sarah poured him coffee without asking. "You hear anything back from those jobs?" she asked gently. Daniel shook his head. "Nope." Sarah sighed but didn't say anything else. She had learned that veterans sometimes needed silence more than encouragement. Max lay beneath the table, though his ears twitched at every sound in the room. Halfway through the coffee, Daniel's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment. Then he answered. "Daniel Carter." A calm, male voice responded. "Mr. Carter, my name is Michael Donovan. I'm an attorney calling from the firm Donovan and Hayes in Kansas City." Daniel frowned slightly. The voice continued. "This may sound unusual, but you've been named as the beneficiary in a will." Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "There is a gentleman who passed away recently," the lawyer said. "A Mr. William Harper." The name meant nothing. "I think you've got the wrong guy," Daniel said. "I assure you we do not," the lawyer replied politely. "Mr. Harper left very specific instructions that you be contacted personally." Daniel leaned back in the booth. "Look, I don't know anyone named William Harper." There was a brief pause. "That may be true," the lawyer said, "but according to his will, Mr. Harper knew you. Max raised his head beneath the table, sensing the shift in Daniel's tone. The lawyer continued. Mr. Carter, you've inherited a property. Daniel's brow tightened. What kind of property? A farm, the lawyer said calmly. A grain and industrial crop farm in western Kansas. Daniel stared out the diner window at the gray sky rolling over Montana. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "You sure you got the right man?" The lawyer answered with quiet certainty. "Yes, Mr. Carter." Max slowly placed his head on Daniel's boot, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close, something waiting, something that might change everything. The office of Donovan and Hayes sat on the 12th floor of a quiet brick building in downtown Kansas City. Through the tall windows behind the desk, the afternoon sun spread across the city like a dull sheet of gold, reflecting off glass towers and distant highways. Daniel Carter sat stiffly in a leather chair that felt far too expensive for someone who had spent the last month sleeping in a pickup truck. Max lay beside him on the polished floor, his large body relaxed, but his ears alert to every sound in the unfamiliar room. Across the desk stood the lawyer who had called him 2 days earlier. Michael Donovan was a tall man in his early 60s with narrow shoulders and careful posture. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and a short white beard framed his jaw, giving him the composed appearance of someone who had spent decades delivering complicated news to strangers. Thin glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, and his calm gray eyes studied Daniel with quiet professionalism. He moved slowly but precisely, the way people often do after years of disciplined routine. "I appreciate you making the trip, Mr. Carter," Donovan said in a measured voice as he opened a thick file folder. Daniel nodded once. "Still not sure why I'm here." Donovan gave a faint smile. "That's understandable." He pulled out a photograph and placed it gently on the desk between them. The photo showed an elderly man standing beside a modest farmhouse, surrounded by tall fields of wheat. The man looked strong despite his age. He had a broad chest, thick forearms, and the sunburned skin of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. A gray mustache covered his upper lip, and deep wrinkles lined the corners of his eyes. He wore faded denim overalls and a wide-brimmed work hat that cast a shadow across his weathered face. "This was William Harper," Donovan said. Daniel studied the picture carefully. The man looked familiar in the vague way strangers sometimes do, but nothing in his memory connected to the name. "I don't know him," Daniel said. "That's what you said on the phone." Donovan turned another page inside the folder and slid a document across the desk. The paper looked older, its edges slightly yellowed. "This," he continued, "is where the story becomes more interesting." Daniel leaned forward. At the top of the page was a military report. Location, northern Syria. Date, 8 years earlier. Daniel felt a slow tightening in his chest as fragments of memory began rising from the back of his mind. The air had been thick with dust that day. Smoke had rolled across the road like storm clouds, and the sound of gunfire had echoed through the valley. Donovan tapped the document lightly. "Mr. Harper was working overseas at the time as an agricultural engineer. He was part of a humanitarian program, helping rebuild irrigation systems in rural areas after several years of conflict." Daniel frowned slightly. The lawyer continued. "According to this report, the convoy transporting several American civilians was attacked while leaving the region. Your team was assigned to extract the survivors." The memory returned suddenly. A damaged truck, a group of frightened civilians crouching behind concrete barriers, and one older man with blood on his sleeve, but still trying to help others climb into the rescue vehicle. Daniel leaned back slowly in the chair. "Wait," he muttered. Donovan nodded calmly, as if he had been expecting the moment. "You remember." Daniel rubbed his jaw, staring again at the photograph. "Yeah, I think I do." The image in his mind sharpened. The man had refused to leave until the last injured worker had been loaded into the transport vehicle. Daniel had grabbed him by the arm and practically dragged him inside as gunfire cracked in the distance. It had lasted maybe 3 minutes, 4 at most. Daniel shook his head slightly. "That was chaos. I didn't even get his name." Donovan folded his hands together. "Mr. Harper remembered yours." He opened another folder and revealed several printed emails and letters. After returning to the United States, Mr. Harper began searching for the Navy unit that had rescued him. It took several months, but eventually he learned the name of the man who had pulled him into the evacuation truck. Daniel felt something strange in his chest. "He tracked me down?" "Not personally," Donovan replied. "He chose not to contact you directly. According to his notes, he believed soldiers deserved the chance to move forward without strangers reopening memories of war." The lawyer turned another page. However, he never forgot what happened that day. Daniel stared silently at the desk. Donovan continued speaking in the calm voice of someone explaining a carefully documented history. William Harper had no children and very little family left. The farm in Kansas had been in his family for nearly 80 years, but he was the last Harper still working the land. In his final years, his health declined rather quickly. The lawyer paused briefly. "And that is when he made the decision written in his will." Daniel looked up. "To leave the farm to me?" "Yes." Donovan slid the final document across the desk. "In his own words," he said, "he believed the man who risked his life to save strangers deserved the chance to build something of his own." Daniel looked down at the page. The handwriting was shaky but firm. A single sentence stood out clearly. "The young man who saved me that day deserves a future worth fighting for." The room became very quiet. Max lifted his head and rested it gently against Daniel's leg, sensing the shift in his breathing. Daniel stared out the office window at the endless Kansas plains stretching toward the horizon. He had spent years feeling like the war had taken everything from him. And now a man he barely remembered had somehow given him something back. A place. A beginning. Daniel exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. Donovan closed the folder with a soft thump. "If you accept the inheritance," he said, "the Harper farm becomes yours." Daniel glanced down at Max. The dog looked back at him with steady, unshakable calm. For the first time in a very long time, the road ahead didn't look empty. The road to Ashford, Kansas, stretched through miles of open farmland that seemed to roll endlessly toward the horizon. Daniel Carter drove slowly along the narrow gravel road, his old pickup kicking up a thin trail of dust behind it. The sky above the plains was wide and pale blue, the kind of sky that made a man feel both free and very small at the same time. Beside him in the passenger seat, Max sat upright, watching the unfamiliar land through the window with calm, alert eyes. Daniel had spent most of the long drive thinking about the man he had only just learned about. William Harper had remembered him for 8 years, long enough to search for his name, long enough to leave behind an entire farm. Daniel still struggled to understand why a moment that had felt so small to him could mean so much to someone else. The gravel road curved around a cluster of tall cottonwood trees, and the property finally came into view. The Harper farm stretched across hundreds of acres of quiet Kansas land. The fields rolled outward in wide squares of dry soil and tall grass that moved gently in the wind. Some areas had clearly been worked recently, their soil dark and clean, but much of the land looked unfinished, as if the plans for the farm had stopped halfway through. Daniel slowed the truck. "Well," he muttered quietly, "this must be it." Max's ears lifted. At the center of the property stood a weathered wooden farmhouse. The building was modest but sturdy, its white paint faded and peeling after years of exposure to the sun and wind. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, and 2 rocking chairs sat there, as if someone had simply stood up and walked away. A few hundred feet beyond the house stood a large red barn. The structure was tall and wide, built from thick wooden beams and sheet metal roofing. But even from a distance, Daniel could see damage along the upper panels, where sections of metal had bent slightly from strong winds. Beyond that, metal irrigation pipes ran across several sections of farmland, though some of the lines looked incomplete. Daniel parked the truck near the farmhouse. When he stepped out, the wind carried the smell of dry earth and distant crops. The air was warmer than Montana had been, but the open plains carried their own kind of quiet loneliness. Max jumped down from the truck and immediately began exploring the area, his nose moving close to the ground as he followed unfamiliar scents. Daniel stood still for a moment, taking in the view. "This place is bigger than I expected," he said quietly. Max barked once in agreement. Inside the farmhouse, the interior was simple but well kept. Wooden floors creaked under Daniel's boots, and the walls were lined with old family photographs. Many of them showed William Harper standing beside tractors, crops, and fields that stretched far into the background. It was clear the farm had once been a proud family operation. But the silence inside the house told another story. Without its owner, the place felt unfinished. Daniel spent the first day walking the property and inspecting what he could. The irrigation system ran across large portions of the fields, but many of the connections were incomplete. Several pipes had been laid out but never attached, suggesting William had been expanding the system before his health declined. Daniel crouched beside one of the pipes and rubbed the back of his neck. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he admitted. Max sat beside him patiently, as if listening to every word. The next morning brought the first of many problems. When Daniel tried starting one of the tractors parked near the barn, the engine coughed twice and died. The battery was dead, and the fuel line appeared to be partially clogged. Daniel spent nearly an hour staring at the engine before realizing he didn't even recognize half the components inside. "Fantastic," he muttered. Later that afternoon, he discovered a thick envelope in the kitchen drawer containing documents related to the property. One page immediately caught his attention. County tax notice, past due. Daniel frowned as he read the numbers. William Harper had fallen behind on land taxes during his final year. The total wasn't impossible to pay, but it was large enough to make Daniel uneasy. "So the farm comes with bills," he said quietly. Max tilted his head. 2 days later, the Kansas weather reminded Daniel just how unpredictable the plains could be. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon late in the afternoon, and the wind grew stronger by the minute. By nightfall, the storm had turned violent. Thunder cracked across the open fields, and heavy rain slammed against the roof of the farmhouse. Daniel stood on the porch watching the storm when a loud metallic crash echoed from the direction of the barn. Max barked sharply and ran ahead. Daniel followed through the rain. One section of the barn's upper roof had torn loose during the storm, allowing wind and water to pour inside. Loose metal panels rattled violently against the wooden beams. "Great," Daniel groaned. It took nearly an hour to secure the worst of the damage with ropes and loose boards. By the time they returned to the house, Daniel was soaked and exhausted. Max, however, remained full of restless energy. The following morning, the dog wandered near the irrigation lines again. Suddenly, Max stopped and began barking toward a patch of tall grass beside one of the pipes. Daniel walked over. Water was slowly leaking from a loose valve connection that had likely shifted during the storm. "Well, I'll be damned," Daniel said. He tightened the joint as best he could, and the leak stopped. "Good catch," he told the dog. Later that afternoon, Max wandered toward the back of the barn and began scratching at the ground, near a wooden door Daniel hadn't noticed before. Curious, Daniel opened it. Inside was a small storage room, filled with sealed containers of grain and seed bags stacked neatly along the walls. Labels marked different crops: wheat, soybeans, and corn. It was clear William Harper had prepared supplies for future planting seasons. Daniel looked around the room slowly. "Guess you had plans after all, old man." That evening, another unexpected event brought Daniel his first connection to the local community. While walking near the edge of the property, Max suddenly sprinted toward a nearby pasture belonging to the neighboring farm. Several frightened cattle were moving nervously near a broken section of fence, and distant howls echoed from the tree line. Two gray shapes darted briefly through the grass. Wolves. Max barked fiercely and ran toward them. The wolves hesitated, then disappeared back into the darkness. A truck's headlights soon appeared on the nearby road. The driver jumped out and hurried toward the cattle. The man was in his mid-50s with a broad chest and thick arms shaped by decades of farm work. His sunburned skin and heavy brown beard gave him the rugged appearance of someone who spent more time outdoors than inside. He wore a faded flannel shirt and worn denim overalls. "My cattle okay?" he called out. Daniel nodded. "Your fence was open." Wolves came close. The man looked at Max, then back at Daniel. "Well, I'll be," he said with a grin. "Looks like your dog just saved me a lot of trouble." He extended a hand. "Name's Tom Alvarez. I run the farm next door." Daniel shook it. "Daniel Carter." Tom nodded toward the Harper fields. "So you're the new owner." Daniel glanced back across the dark farmland stretching behind him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess I am." And standing there, under the wide Kansas sky, Daniel realized the Harper farm wasn't just land. It was going to be a test. Morning sunlight spilled across the Kansas plains as Daniel Carter stood on the porch of the old Harper farmhouse, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a wide patchwork of soil, grass, and half-finished irrigation lines left behind by a man who had clearly run out of time. Max lay beside the wooden steps, his large German Shepherd body relaxed in the warmth of the early sun. The 6-year-old dog had already explored nearly every corner of the farm over the past few days, but his ears still lifted whenever the wind carried an unfamiliar sound. Daniel took a slow breath and looked across the property again. 3 days had passed since the storm damaged the barn, and he had already learned one important truth about the farm. Nothing here was simple. The machinery needed repairs, the irrigation system was incomplete, and the land taxes sitting on the kitchen table reminded him that time was not on his side. Still, the place no longer felt like a stranger's property. It felt like a puzzle, waiting to be understood. That morning, Daniel decided to begin with the farmhouse itself. The interior still carried the quiet order of William Harper's life. Tools were arranged neatly in drawers. Kitchen shelves held jars of preserved vegetables, carefully labeled with dates from the previous year. It was clear the old farmer had been organized, the kind of man who planned ahead for everything. Daniel climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The upper level contained only 2 rooms, a small bedroom and a cramped study filled with wooden shelves. Dust floated through the sunlight streaming from the window, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. Max followed him in, sniffing carefully along the floorboards. Daniel began opening drawers and boxes, hoping to find documents related to the farm's operations. Most of what he discovered were receipts, seed catalogs, and weather journals that recorded rainfall patterns going back nearly 10 years. Then he noticed something different. A thick leather notebook sat at the back of a wooden desk drawer. The cover was worn and slightly cracked, as though it had been opened and closed thousands of times. Daniel lifted it carefully and flipped to the first page. The handwriting was firm but uneven. William Harper's journal. Daniel sat down in the wooden chair and began reading. The entries stretched back nearly 6 years. Most of them described the slow progress of building the farm into something larger. William had written detailed notes about soil conditions, irrigation designs, crop rotation systems, and plans for future planting seasons. But what surprised Daniel most was the scale of the old man's vision. William Harper hadn't simply been maintaining a family farm. He had been building something new. One entry caught Daniel's attention. If the irrigation network is completed, the southern fields could support enough wheat to supply several towns. The land is good. It only needs time and careful hands. Daniel turned the page. Another entry followed months later. The future of farming has to change. Smaller communities need reliable local food again. Large corporations are buying everything, but land like this could still serve people directly. Daniel leaned back slowly in the chair. The journal continued with sketches of irrigation routes and planting zones that spread across nearly the entire property. William had been designing a farm built not only for profit, but for long-term sustainability. Then, Daniel reached a page that made him stop reading. The entry was dated just over a year earlier. The handwriting looked shakier than the others. I'm getting older now. The doctors say I should slow down, but the land still needs work. I've been thinking about that young Navy man again, the one who pulled me into that evacuation truck all those years ago. Daniel's chest tightened. He kept reading. He didn't know my name, and I barely knew his. But that moment gave me the chance to come home again. A second life, in a way. The next line was written slowly, as if William had paused between each word. The soldier who saved my life deserves a place to start over. Daniel closed the journal for a moment. For years he had believed that his time in the military had taken more from him than it had given. The war had left scars that never fully faded. But somewhere in the world, one man had seen that moment very differently. To William Harper, that rescue had been the beginning of everything that came afterward. Max stepped closer and nudged Daniel's arm gently. I know, Daniel said quietly. He looked around the small study again. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, the farm no longer felt like an accident. It felt like a responsibility. Over the following weeks, Daniel began working through the plans recorded in William's journal. The learning process was slow and frustrating. But the old farmer had left detailed notes that helped guide him through the basics. Tom Alvarez, the neighbor Daniel had met a few nights earlier, stopped by several times to offer advice. Tom arrived most mornings in an aging blue pickup truck that rattled loudly as it rolled across the dirt driveway. The broad-shouldered farmer carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent his entire life working the land. His thick brown beard had begun turning gray around the edges, and his deep voice carried a friendly tone that made it easy to trust him. Harper knew what he was doing, Tom said one afternoon while examining the irrigation pipes. He just ran out of time. Daniel nodded. That's what it looks like. They worked together, repairing sections of the irrigation network over the next several days. It was exhausting labor under the Kansas sun, but the slow progress gave Daniel a sense of direction he hadn't felt in years. Max stayed close during the work, often wandering along the edges of the fields. One afternoon, the dog suddenly began barking near a patch of loose soil close to the western irrigation line. Daniel walked over. What is it, buddy? Max pawed at the ground, digging through the dry dirt until a section of buried metal pipe became visible. Daniel knelt and brushed the soil away. A hidden irrigation branch. According to the diagrams in William's journal, that underground pipe connected to one of the unfinished southern fields. Without it, water pressure would never reach the far end of the property. Daniel followed the pipe's direction with his eyes and slowly smiled. "Well," he said, scratching Max behind the ears, "you may have just saved the entire harvest." Max wagged his tail proudly. As the sun began setting across the plains, Daniel stood at the edge of the field and looked across the land once more. The farm still had a long way to go, but for the first time, Daniel Carter no longer felt like a man drifting without purpose. He had work to do, and this land was giving him a reason to keep going. 2 years passed across the Kansas plains in a quiet rhythm of work, weather, and persistence. Seasons changed the land again and again. In spring, the soil softened under gentle rain, and the first green shoots pushed through the earth. In summer, the fields shimmered under endless sunlight, stretching toward the horizon like a living ocean of grain. Autumn painted the land gold and amber, while winter brought cold winds that swept across the empty fields and rattled the wooden fences around the farm. Through every season, Daniel Carter worked. At the beginning, the work had felt overwhelming. The Harper farm had been half-finished when he arrived, a place filled with good intentions but incomplete systems. Irrigation lines had needed repairs. Old tractors had required weeks of maintenance. And the tax debt hanging over the land had forced Daniel to learn quickly how to manage both crops and finances. But slowly, piece by piece, the farm began to change. The barn that had once been damaged by a storm now stood solid again. Daniel had replaced the torn metal panels with new roofing sheets and reinforced the wooden beams inside. The interior now held working equipment that had been repaired, cleaned, and carefully maintained. The irrigation system, once confusing and incomplete, now stretched across most of the property. The underground pipe Max had discovered had become a crucial part of the network, allowing water to reach the far southern fields that William Harper had once hoped to cultivate. And those fields were no longer empty. Wide stretches of wheat now grew where bare soil had once waited. In other sections of the farm, rows of soybeans spread across the land in neat green lines. The crops moved gently whenever the Kansas wind passed through them, creating a soft rustling sound that carried across the fields like quiet applause. Max had grown older during those 2 years, though his strength had not faded. The German Shepherd was now nearly 8 years old, his thick black and tan coat slightly grayer around the muzzle. His broad chest and powerful legs still moved with the steady confidence of a working dog, and his alert amber eyes missed very little happening on the farm. He followed Daniel everywhere. During planting season, Max trotted beside the tractor as if supervising the entire operation. During harvest, he patrolled the fields and barns, occasionally barking whenever unfamiliar animals wandered too close. But most of the time, he simply stayed near Daniel. Tom Alvarez remained Daniel's closest neighbor and strongest ally. The rugged farmer from the next property had become a regular presence at the Harper farm. Tom was still the same broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin and a thick beard that had grown increasingly gray with time. Years of working the land had given him a patient, steady temperament. And though his words were often blunt, there was kindness behind them. Tom had once told Daniel that farming had taught him one simple truth. "The land doesn't care who you used to be," he had said while leaning against a fence one evening. "It only cares if you're willing to work." Daniel had remembered that sentence many times, and he had worked. Little by little, the Harper farm had begun producing more crops than Daniel could manage alone. That success eventually brought new connections with the nearby town of Ashford. One of those connections was a man named Samuel Grayson, the owner of a small grain distribution warehouse on the edge of town. Samuel Grayson was a tall man in his late 40s, with a lean build and long arms that moved constantly while he talked. His dark hair was streaked lightly with gray, and a narrow pair of glasses rested low on his nose. Unlike many people in town who had spent their lives in agriculture, Samuel had originally studied business in college before returning to Ashford to help manage his family's storage and supply operation. His calm voice and thoughtful personality made him well respected among the local farmers. When Samuel first visited the Harper farm, he had walked slowly through the fields, examining the wheat and soybean rows with careful attention. "You've done something impressive here," he told Daniel one afternoon. Daniel had shrugged modestly. "Still learning." Samuel smiled slightly. "That's the best kind of farmer." Before long, Samuel's warehouse began buying grain directly from Daniel's harvests. The partnership allowed the Harper farm to become a steady supplier for several nearby towns. It was not a massive operation, but it was stable, and stability was something Daniel had not felt in a very long time. One late autumn afternoon, Daniel stood on the porch of the farmhouse as the sun began lowering across the golden fields. The wheat harvest had been strong that year. The storage barns were nearly full, and the irrigation system had worked perfectly throughout the dry summer months. Daniel leaned back in the old wooden rocking chair that had once belonged to William Harper. Max lay beside the porch steps, his ears raised slightly as he listened to distant sounds drifting across the land. A flock of birds passed overhead, their wings cutting softly through the evening air. The farm was quiet, but it was the peaceful kind of quiet that comes from work completed and land that is finally alive again. Inside the house, one small change had appeared over the past year. In the living room, above a wooden bookshelf filled with William's old journals, Daniel had placed a framed photograph. The photo showed the elderly farmer standing beside his wheat fields, the same image Daniel had first seen in the lawyer's office. Below the picture was a small handwritten note Daniel had added himself. "The man who gave me a second chance." Daniel looked at that photograph often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. If William Harper had not remembered that brief moment during the evacuation years ago, Daniel might never have come to Kansas. He might still be drifting from job to job, carrying memories that felt heavier than any future. But this land had changed something inside him. The work had given his days structure. The responsibility had given his life direction. For the first time since leaving the military, Daniel Carter no longer felt like a man trying to escape his past. He felt like someone building something that would last. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant fields, painting the sky with soft orange and purple light. Daniel rested his arms on the porch railing. Max lifted his head and looked toward him, his calm eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. Daniel reached down and scratched the dog gently behind the ears. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "I think we made it." Max wagged his tail once and settled comfortably beside him. And as the evening wind moved softly through the golden fields, Daniel Carter realized something he had not felt in many years. For the first time in a very long time, he was home. Sometimes life gives us moments that feel small at the time, but years later we realize they were never small at all. Daniel once helped a stranger during a chaotic moment in war. He didn't know the man's name, and he never expected to see him again. Yet that single act of courage traveled through time and changed his life in a way he could never have imagined. A forgotten farm, a second chance, and a purpose waiting quietly on the other side of hardship. Maybe that is how God often works in our lives, not always with loud miracles, but with quiet ones. A kind word, a helping hand, a decision to do the right thing when no one is watching. Sometimes those small choices become seeds planted by God, growing into blessings many years later. The story reminds us of something simple but powerful. What we do for others is never truly lost. God sees every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment we choose compassion instead of indifference. And sometimes, when the time is right, those moments return to us in ways we never expected. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment today to do something kind for someone. You never know how far that small act may travel in God's plan. And if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need hope today. I would also love to hear from you. What moment in your life felt like a quiet miracle from God? Leave a comment and share your story. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support helps these stories reach more people who may need encouragement. May God bless you and your family today. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and hope to your path. Thank you for being here.